The case of the missing firewood. This may be pushing Rule 6 a little, but this happened when my grandfather was growing up in rural Kansas in the 40s and 50s. And is one of my favorite stories from him. When my grandpa was growing up, he didn't have electricity. This being rural Kansas, what they did have was a wood-burning stove. At one point, firewood at great-grandfather had been storing began to disappear. A thief was afoot. My great-grandfather, getting tired of the firewood disappearing, hatches a plan. Great-grandfather takes some of the logs and drills them out, leaving a cavity. He then puts some gunpowder in the cavities and plugs the holes to hide his handiwork. That night he tells my grandpa that he would bring in the firewood. Of course he knows what logs he's messed with. Now this is the funny part, and I wish I knew how embellished it was. But stranger things have happened. The next day, great-grandfather is walking into town and comes across a gentleman also headed into town, and they get to talking. It turns out the gentleman is going into town to make a purchase. The item he seeks, a new stove. He says to my great-grandfather, "I don't know what they're putting in the coal these days, but it destroyed my stove. No wood ever went missing again. Can't drive through that." TLDR at bottom. On mobile. Not my revenge, but I witnessed it. Back in 2004 we had those big plastic round garbage bins in our back alley. About 6 of them down every alley in my neighborhood. They were huge. About 4 foot tall, 4 foot wide at the top. They got emptied every Thursday around 8 in the morning. I lived half a block down the alley from the local bar, and every few weeks I'd go out in there morning to see all the bins knocked down. Some drunk idiot was driving his beater home around the time the bar closed at 2 a.m. I figured he was hitting them on purpose just for laughs. Once winter came, the plastic got more brittle and every bin that was hit got cracked and or destroyed. The city never did anything other than just replace the bins, but it would take a few weeks and it was irritating to have to pick them up all the time or use a farther away bin cause the nearby one was toast. So this continued for months, and winter gets cold here in Canada. We had a solid week of -40. One Saturday night I saw red and blue lights flashing through my curtains. Walked out to see a completely totaled mid-80s Buick wrapped around a bin. One of my neighbors decided to fill the bin with water, which froze into a solid block of ice. I don't know for sure which neighbor did it, but they are absolute heroes in my mind. Guy got arrested, so I assume he was charged with drunk driving at the least. Tow truck took away what was left of the car, but the bin stayed there for a couple months as a monument to stupidity filled with ice cause it was too heavy to move and also wasn't in the least bit damaged by the collision. TLDR, drunk guy likes smashing empty bins with his car in the winter. Neighbor fills one with water. Water freezes. Drunk guy totals car. Gets arrested. He ruined my sister's only birth experience, so I made sure he'd never forget her. Obligatory apology for formatting as I'm on mobile. Kinda my revenge. Kinda my sister's. Both of us really proud. This is gonna be long, so TLDR at bottom. Here's our cast. My sister, we'll call her Sarah for the story. Sister's ex-BF Paul. Ex-BF's new wife Jane. Ex-BF's parents Mr. and Mrs. Doe. Oldest brother Zeke. Our parents and me. When I was 14 and my oldest sister, Sarah, was 22, we found out that she was pregnant with Paul, her boyfriend of 4 years. They immediately got engaged and they were really happy. For a time, Sarah had a horrible pregnancy. About 16 to 18 weeks in, the wonder of creating a human life evaporated within her. She developed hyperemesis, which, if you don't know, is really bad morning sickness. She was constantly in pain. She developed gestational diabetes, and just all around hated the experience. Around this time, Paul, the then fiancé, started getting sick of the complaining. I believe the argument was your body is built to do this. It can't be that bad. Sarah was due around Valentine's Day and Paul's parents, Mr. and Mrs. Doe, were very excited, both about the grandkid and the fact that he could be born on a holiday. She was very against that and really hoped that her son wouldn't be born on a holiday, even one as small as Valentine's Day. Her birthday sometimes falls on Easter and she hates it, because it might make him feel that his day isn't very much about him. Well, Mrs. Doe says something like, well, if you name him Valentine or Valentino, then that'll make the day even more special to him. Again, Sister hated the idea. She thought it was tacky. He'd be bullied for it, and just really didn't like the name Valentino. Paul loved it, but agreed to go with a more average name like Daniel or Jared. Fast forward to February and she was ready to get this over with. Sarah had officially been put on bed rest because while standing or walking her blood pressure took unexpected spikes and dips. I look back now and goodness do I feel bad for her. She was doing her best to avoid giving birth on Valentine's Day because, again, she didn't want him born on a holiday. Unfortunately, births happen when they happen and that baby was going to come on Valentine's Day whether she wanted him to or not. I remember waiting out in the waiting room with my dad, brothers, and Paul, who couldn't stand to be in the delivery room because it was gross. I was so mad that he could have gone in but wouldn't because he thought my sister was gross while giving birth, whereas I had to stay outside because I was too young to go in with my mom and other sister. Dad went home with the youngest two brothers while the oldest, Zeke, stayed to watch me because I refused to leave. 16 hours after Sarah went into labor, my little nephew was officially part of the family on their evening of Valentine's Day. Unfortunately, Sarah was not okay. She had to have an emergency cesarean section and while doing the operation discovered that the back of her uterus, facing her spinal cord, had a very large and very severe, thankfully non-cancerous, tumor. When I say large I mean it was twice the size of a standard uterus. The doctors were shocked and didn't understand why nobody had noticed it on an ultrasound. It accounted for her severe back pain and blood pressure issues. The doctors immediately went in for more surgery to remove the tumor, but sadly ended up having to perform a full hysterectomy. This meant that my nephew would be Sarah's only child. Now while Sarah was in for surgery, Paul was taking care of everything baby-related to make sure his son was okay. In my 14-year-old self's memory I remember him being suitably distraught. But I didn't really pay him much mind and spent my time in the waiting room with my mother and other sister, Zeke. However, wanted to be a good future brother-in-law and make sure that Paul was okay. He found Paul filling out the baby paperwork on his own, looking, in my brother's words, like he had not a single worry in his mind. Zeke asked why Paul didn't wait for Sarah to fill out the paperwork as she should have been put of surgery within the hour, and Paul said that he just wanted her to get her rest and heal. That checked out with Zeke, as he was 16 and didn't know any better at the time. Now I know what you're probably thinking. No, he wouldn't. He knows how much she hates that name. And still, she'd need to sign the paperwork too. My fellow peoples of Reddit, I regret to inform you that Paul forged Sarah's signature on the paperwork and waited until she was out of surgery to hand said paperwork over. My sweet nephew, that was born on Valentine's Day, was named Valentino on his first official birth certificate. I still to this day don't know why Paul and his family were so insistent about the name. He had even picked out a different one with my sister. And before you ask, no, he was never brought up on forgery charges because his parents were witnesses to her signing the papers, even though they only got there at the last minute. So Sarah dumped him and got her son's name changed a month later. She was willing to do split custody with him because that's her son's father and she wants the kid to know him. But Paul vanished and she never heard anything back, which seemed weirdly out of character to us, until a mutual friend on Facebook was tagged in his wedding pictures 6 months later. Paul had apparently started cheating on her not long after she got pregnant. Sarah was livid, but there wasn't much she could do, so she filed for child support and continued to live her best life. Until 6 years later. This is where the revenge starts, my friends. So Sarah has been a single mother for the past 6 years and has been amazing at it. At this point in my career, I've been a hairdresser for about 8 months at our local Great Clips. I'm working one day, and who is seated before me but Jane, Paul's wife, herself. I take her back for a trim and she clearly has no idea who I am. That adds up because a mutual friend that still keeps in contact with Paul said that Jane doesn't know a thing. She has no idea about Sarah, that she was the other woman, or that Paul actually has a kid that he's been infrequently paying child support for. She's in the dark on it all. I told myself not to be an ass and treat her like a normal customer, which I did. Now at this point, Jane was heavily pregnant, so a lot of our conversation was about that. She loved being pregnant, but it was hard. Her husband was so unsympathetic. Big shocker. And she was due in 10 weeks and they still hadn't picked out a name for their baby girl. Ladies and gentle peoples, this was my chance. I asked what kind of name she was looking for and she said, "I want something unique and unusual, but not ridiculous like Brainly." You know the ones I'm talking about. And Paul had suggested so many already and she didn't like any of them. So I, conniving little weasel I am, said, "What about Sarah?" Quote, "My sister's name isn't actually Sarah, she was named after an older family member that passed not long after she was born. But there was no female equivalent for his name, so our parents created one. It's a beautiful name and just what Jane was looking for. She loved it. She stuck by it, and I found out by stalking her Facebook months later that she had put her foot down about it, and that was their daughter's name. Now Paul has a daughter with his ex's name to remind him every day about her, and to also remind him to pay his beeping child support. Little nephew is 10 years old now with a new name and no contact with his biological father, though we do still sometimes call him Val as a family nickname. He likes it but doesn't want to bring it to school, so it's staying a family nickname. Sarah pretends to hate when we call him that, in a joking way. As long as he likes it, she doesn't have a problem with it. And she's seeing a new guy who's really great and like a father to Val. TLDR, my sister's baby daddy forged her signature on paperwork while she was in surgery to name their son, a name that she had been avidly against from the beginning. Then broke all contact when she dumped him and married the girl he was cheating on her with while she was pregnant. 6 years later I meet his wife and convince her to name her daughter my sister's name because the wife has no idea my sister and her son exist. Edit. Gosh, now I know what they mean about rip inbox tears of joy. Thank you to the kind strangers for all the awards, especially the gold. We did not expect this to blow up like it did. Val wanted to let all you other Valentine's babies know that he feels your pain.
Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe for more Reddit content.